Well, welcome back from your spring break. I guess that's what we'll call it. We need to continue on our notes. We ended up the other day with the different types of commercial and subsistence agriculture. If you've completely forgotten or need a quick review of that information, I would stop this and go back to that discussion number one first, and then pick up with this because this is just a continuation of those notes. But what we're focusing on and what you're going to be kind of accountable for is these four different types of agriculture that we find in LDCs in less developed countries. So typically, but not always, these are going to be subsistence based. The first type is called shifting cultivation. You may have also heard it called slash and burn farming, which we see here. And there's a couple of things to note when you're filling out your charts, your review guides. Number one, this is definitely subsistence. They're doing this to consume it, they're not doing it to sell it. And it takes place a lot of times in tropical regions. Shifting cultivation is attributed to parts of losing the rainforest because you have to chop down the trees and you've got to clear an area to be able to grow crops on it. For the longest time, it was somewhat sustainable, but what ends up happening is when you slash and burn an area, oddly enough, rainforest land is not very fertile. So you can only grow crops on it for 2 to 3 years, then you've got to do what's called letting it lay fallow, which means you just let it sit, and it will eventually gain its fertility back over the course of about 5 or 6 years. But in the meantime, you have to create another plot of land. And so that's what kind of how it's attributed to that. We also know that LDCs have huge growing populations, so more land has to be attributed to it, which leads to deforestation. A couple of pictures here that you can see, like this is slash and burn agriculture. And what you'll notice is they're burning this debris to clear land, but that's not just to clear it. It's also because anytime you burn something, the ash can be used as fertilizer. It's adding nutrients back to the soil. So it is sustainable, but it's not something you can't use this land over and over and over and over again all the time. You've got to let it sit and rest for extended periods of time, pick out another plot to use, clear it, and then maybe come back to that other plot a few years later. The second type is what is known as pastoral nomadism. Nomadic, if you've heard of somebody being a nomad, it means they don't have a set home. They're constantly moving and wandering. This is subsistence agriculture, but you're not necessarily growing crops. Pastoral nomads are all about their animals. They're herds. And typically we see this with sheep and goats, not necessarily with cattle. And the reason is what you'll notice about pastoral nomadism is they're moving all the time because these are very dry areas that would be tough to grow crops in. So as a result, yes, camels are used for transportation, but the main thing that they use to grow per se would be sheep and goats because these two animals are basically walking grocery stores. They provide, yes, meat. They provide milk, which can be turned into cheeses or butters or anything else. But they also provide wool, and wool can provide clothing. It can provide shelter, like we see here. It can provide lots of different types of things that you need for survival. And so instead of just having to slaughter an animal, they can use these over and over and over again, not to mention sheep and goats literally eat anything. So they don't have to have these nice green lush pastures. They can eat these little scraps and remnants in an area. So cattle, not great in the desert, but goats and sheep are because you don't have to find these lush green areas. I'm going to go back 2 slides now. So what you'll notice is shifting cultivation is near the equator. That's where most of your rainforests are going to be found. But then look at pastoral nomadism, Sahara Desert, dry areas of Central Asia, and then also into these northern regions where their herds become reindeer, which are very conducive to colder Arctic climates. The third type is what is known as intensive subsistence. First of all, look at your root term. It's intense. It's going to get the most bang for its buck. And so what this means is you have to provide a ton of food on a small amount of land. This is typically practiced in areas of East and South Asia, and what we know is this is India and this is China, and they have over 1 billion people each. So you've got to find a way to feed that enormous population on an area that is smaller than that of the United States. So you've got to use every bit of land possible to feed those people, which means typically they practice something known as double cropping, which means they'll take not one but two crops a year. The other thing to be able to do that is these are typically in warm climates that don't change, also kind of near the equator. Um, a lot of times rice is grown in these areas, and something I want you to look at, like this is what might be considered the side of a mountain or a steep slope. This might not be something we would use for agriculture in the US, but what you notice they've done is they've terraced it. They've made stair steps out of it to be able to grow on top. So they're using every bit of available land for agriculture to be able to feed these immense populations. This is Bali, which is part of Indonesia, Thai or Thailand, these rice farmers, but you also see it in areas of China, southern China, India, and these huge populations. Pakistan also practices as well. Another good example here, again, you're using every single available inch. And a lot of times the dominant crop grown in intensive subsistence is rice. Now, this is the same exact type of agriculture, but what you notice is wet rice not dominant. Rice requires a ton of rain. So, if you're not getting a ton of rain, you simply have to change what you're growing. And that is why in Central Asia, Northern India, or I guess actually it'd be Western India, and areas that are too dry for rice, they're going to grow things like wheat, barley, millet, oats, corn, soybeans. But the way they do this is still exactly the same. They may terrace the land and the hillside slopes, they may double crop, but they got to produce a ton of food to feed that population. The last one is known as plantation farming. This is actually something that is not subsistence. They're growing these crops to sell them. A lot of times it's cash crops. You see them here: cotton, sugar, coffee, rubber. These aren't things you necessarily consume. Yes, bananas, but they don't necessarily consume these. They're sold, I'm sorry, they're grown to sell, especially coffee. And typically they're going to be sold to MDCs. A lot of times MDCs own this land, and they do that because they can hire cheap labor in LDC. So let's say that it's the Dominican Republic. Maybe a big corporation in the United States goes and buys this huge, farm or plantation or plot of land in the Dominican Republic or somewhere like Jamaica. And what they do is they know that we can't grow necessarily coffee or sugar or things like that here, but they can grow it there. Well, now you've got land and you've got cheap labor to employ. And so they'll use that to be able to take advantage of A, the cheap labor, but B, being able to sell it back to MDCs. Agriculture does have an impact on the environment, especially commercial style. But specifically, what we have to understand is that there's a term here known as land degradation, which means you're doing harmful things. The two types that we are going to be accountable for here are deforestation and desertification, and they're related to one another. Desertification is an expansion of desert conditions. You can see this as far as this, it once was a very nice area and now it's become desert. And it's the result of, it could be drought, so maybe that you've taken a river and you've irrigated it to where these areas aren't receiving water anymore. Maybe it's deforestation, you're cutting down trees. It can also be overgrazing. If you can imagine that, let's say that you're a cattle farmer and you have these 1,500-pound animals trekking through this grass. Well, every time their foot hits, they're going to pull up some grass and dirt just because they're so heavy. Well, if you pull the roots out of the ground, it dries the soil out very quickly and it can become a desert-like condition. The Sahel of Africa is a great example of this. The Sahara Desert, this is the true Sahara Desert, but as you can see, these areas have grown. These were not always Sahara Desert. They were actually grassland regions, but because these areas and the people in these areas like to have cattle, they started cutting down the trees, and when they did that and then grazed animals on them, the Sahara Desert has literally grown as a result of it. So deforestation and taking down trees and growing cattle can actually lead to desertification. And you can see, look at the world, these areas that are vulnerable to desertification. All of our western portion of the United States, these areas, because look, what they grow down here, they raise lots and lots of cattle in Argentina, and so they're cutting down trees like crazy. These are parts of the Amazon rainforest. And we see the whole entire Saharan region of Africa and the Middle East and Central Asia, even the outback. These are dry, arid regions that if they're not taken care of, they'll turn into true, complete deserts. Some of them already are, as we can see. Hyper arid, that's a desert. Desert, desert, desert. But understanding that you can't just go through and do whatever you want to in these regions becomes very important. On your own, I'd like for y'all to go back through and look at some of these as far as what humans have done and how it's affected these regions. The dried up Aral Sea, this is once used to be one of the world's biggest inland bodies of water, and it has shrunk to about a tenth of its original size just because of the way that people dealt with the rivers. Desertification, which we just talked about a second ago. And then I'm going to go back. The other thing, though, is what you're seeing here. This is called strip mining. You see the different strips. Well, obviously, that's going to have a huge environmental impact, but also something called fracking. Fracking has been kind of the centerpiece of a lot of attempted legislation lately. People say it's very dangerous because it releases natural gas. But what people are doing in fracking is they're trying to take this shale, this oil that's found inside the earth, but not from, doesn't have this like huge pool of it. They're trying to extract it in different ways by forcing air and water down into the ground, which a lot of people say is very dangerous because it releases natural gas. So go back and watch this video too. All of this relates back to agriculture, primary sector activities, and the negative things that can go along with it. The other thing, make sure that you're going ahead and that you are filling out your review guides. We're going to continue doing things to make sure that you're getting grades and make sure that you can positively impact your grade the way that you want to. But to do that, you've got to take part in the work. So make sure you're doing that. Other than that, y'all have an awesome day, and we will talk to you again. I know that we're going to have a meeting on Thursday, so I'd love for y'all to attend, so make sure you're there.